Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Morton. My pronouns are she, her. I am the artist and studio manager here at Baltimore Clayworks. We are thrilled that you all have joined us. We currently have 5 resident artists. They will all be giving virtual artist talks on Tuesdays from 2 to 2:30. Next week on November 15th, we will have Vanna Ramirez. On November 29th, we will have Shay Keister. Kieran Joan will be giving her talk on December 6th, and December 13th, we will have Patrick Bell. For more information about these artists, please visit baltimoreclayworks.org. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual artist talk today by Clarissa Pezone. She was our 2021 to 22 Lormina Salter Fellow and now is a long-term resident artist. I will now turn it over to Clarissa.
All right. Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming. I'm just going to share screen really quick here. All right. So as Rebecca said, I am a resident artist here at Baltimore Clayworks in my 2nd year. And thank you, Rebecca, for organizing this event for the resident artists, for myself, and the ones to come in the next weeks. So my name is Clarissa Pezone. My pronouns are she, her. And in this talk, I'm going to go over a brief history of my background and my education. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the recent body of work that I've been making. And okay, so I grew up in Sacramento, which is a medium-sized city in the center of California, and I went to Humboldt State University for my undergrad. So when I first got to Humboldt State for about the first 2 years, I kind of dabbled around and had a little trouble figuring out what I wanted to do. I hadn't come from, a high school that had a really firm art program, and so I started out thinking maybe I wanted to do creative writing, and then I moved towards sociology, and then eventually I found my way into the community and the ceramics area. And I think about this time a lot now that I'm teaching, especially because of how powerful it was for me at that time to have the ceramics professor act as a mentor to me, since I had been kind of lost up till that point. And he kind of, established that he believed in me and that he believed in the work that I was making. And to me at the time, that was really powerful. And, 10-ish years later, it's really made an effect on my trajectory in my life. So, these are my undergraduate professor's work. So on the upper left-hand side is Keith Schneider, who actually was the only professor that I ever took a class from. But Louis Maroc, who's on the right with the piece with the hands, was a big influence as well. He was actually retired at the time that I was there, but he came to my honors critiques when I was in the honors program and gave his advice, and he was kind of just around as a voice of reason. Nancy Frazier was actually the tech for the department, but she also, she helped me write my artist statement. She came to all my critiques. And so there was this really lovely ecosystem there that really helped foster the student body. And after I graduated in 2013, I did a post-bac, still at Humboldt State University. And this is when I really started hand building. Throughout my undergraduate education, I've been mostly working on the wheel and adding sculptural elements to mugs or to other functional vessels. But at this time, I really moved away into sculpture. And so for me at that time, what that meant was closing off vessel forms or creating forms that had to do with or were influenced by historical pottery. And at the time during college and during this year afterwards, I was working as a caregiver for the elderly. And that really did have an effect on the way that I started thinking about the body at the time and transience. Since I was, young and didn't have much experience in those areas. So it was pretty affecting for me. And it made its way into my work. And after my time at Humboldt, I moved back to Sacramento, and I rented a studio in this 100-year-old pottery factory that had been reformatted into studios and was an artist collective. And so I shared a studio with a few different artists, and we worked together as a collective to organize events and classes, and to have shows in a newly built gallery in the space, and to organize shows offsite as well. And so it's kind of a special time. This building, after the fire in the Oakland studio, ended up getting shut down, but the time that we had there was really special. And this ended up being a time that I made a body of work that I applied to graduate school with. And it was the first time that I also moved from using vessel forms into trying to render the body in like 3-dimensional space. And so at the time I was thinking about growth and decay, and I was also thinking about the work of Jason DeCaires Taylor, who's an artist who took body casts of full figures and in cement and submerged them underwater so that coral reefs could grow on them. And part of this, I think, was processing, having moved away from Humboldt, which was a coastal town. So a regular part of my routine there had been like driving 5 minutes to the beach to go exercise or to walk around and look at the tide pools. And so this was kind of processing that change of my reality. And it also was, this series of work helped me discover that something that really interests me in working with ceramics is creating work that has a lot of like minutia, a lot of tiny things, or a lot of focused activity. And so from this body of work, I moved forward in 2016 to take a workshop with Tip Toland, who is a wonderful figure sculptor. And I took this workshop from her at Idlewild Art Center in Southern California. And what we did was we learned how to model a bust of a figure using a life model and building solid on a metal armature. And what this did for me was it helped me realize that working realistically was something that I wanted to pursue, and that it kind of fulfilled that same desire to get into like the details of a piece. And it also helped me realize that using reference material and observation could help me like pursue my goals in my work. And so I started working in this vein of the realistic figure and tried to pursue learning the anatomy of the body. So I was doing mostly truncated bust forms and trying to get as anatomically correct as possible. And so this piece was actually the last piece that I made in Sacramento before I moved cross country to Pennsylvania, where I accepted a position as a graduate student at Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania. And so in my early time at Edinburgh University, I was still creating work by building solid on an armature and adding other components once it was hollowed out, and using baldness and truncation of the figure and hands and additions to talk about kind of this hard to access psychological interior. And in 2018, I think, maybe 2017, there was, I ended up taking a workshop with Christina West. And this was another like pivotal point for me, or opportunity for growth. We learned how to model the full body using coil and slab methods, which is something I hadn't done before this point. And part of this was working with another woman who was a sculptor who I looked up to. And part of this was that it helped me realize that I wanted to work with the full body for the way that it acts in space with the viewer. And another way that this workshop was a jumping off point for me was that Christina West introduced me to the idea of the uncanny as like a theory in art. And it had been something that I'd been kind of trying to do without knowing that there was an art term for it. And so her introduction to the uncanny for me had kind of a ripple effect in realizing that that was the research that I was interested in doing. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the uncanny a little later on. And at this point, I also was at Edinburgh, and I was starting to realize that I wanted to leave the program, which is a little bit unusual in the MFA fine arts programs. I think generally people just suffer through if they aren't that happy with the program they're in. And not to say that I was suffering, because it is a great program, but there were a few things that weren't matching up with what I really wanted out of the degree. One of those being that I really wanted teaching experience, and that wasn't possible there. And so in 2018, I applied and I made the difficult choice to accept a position at Indiana University, Bloomington. And so I got to Indiana, and within a short period of time after moving, during the orientation to graduate school, I ended up getting a call from my mom, and she told me that she had received a cancer diagnosis. And so this moment in 2018, I think, was like one of the most pivotal moments in my life. In just a lot of ways, it felt like an entire body cell turnover. And so this was the beginning of a few years of intense struggle for her and also for me. So I wanted to show you guys my mom. So this is my mom, Susan, and she's holding a flower called Forever Susans. And it's really hard for me to talk about my graduate school experience and for me to talk about my work now without talking about going through, my mom's illness by her side. And so in the program at IU, I was carrying over themes from the work that I had been making at Edinburgh, which is using fracturing and kind of like truncated parts to show touch and relationships and to get across psychology, like living on the interior of the vessel of the piece. And these were really influenced by Greek and Roman figurative statuary as well, and kind of the passage of time or the damage done to those objects. And during this time, I was really struggling with the limbo and the grief of the diagnosis for my mom. And so for me, the grief that stretched through this time came out in my work, and there was kind of this violent undertone to how I was using the material, to the way that I was representing bodies as well. And to me, a quote by Doug Jack, when I saw him give an artist lecture, really rang true for me for this work and for this period of time for me, which is that he said, the beautiful thing about clay is that it lets you treat it badly while you're treating yourself badly. And that felt really emblematic of this moment for me. And this is an image of Doug Jack's work. This is actually an image of a collaboration piece that he made for a show called Duet for the Portland NCCA in 2019. And it was, a collaboration with Christine Golden. And Doug Jack really, unfortunately, passed away earlier this year, way too young, in his 50s. And I'm really grateful to have met him this last year and gotten to speak with him about my work and just in general. He was a brilliant artist. And in my early graduate school work, I was using androgyny and baldness and kind of using those in a way to talk about the pieces having to do with like the everyman or being objects that anybody could project themselves onto. And so this piece in particular was kind of a reckoning for me, because I made this piece during the time that my mom was losing her hair from chemo. And it made me realize how deeply painful the loss of identity from losing your hair can be. And so it kind of checked my worldview in a lot of ways. And it made me realize that like I didn't feel capable or able to make work that I could even say was applicable to everybody or that people could project onto, because I only knew my experience. And so it was a turning point for the way that I talked about representing the body in that way. And the other reason that this piece was important for me was that it also helped me realize the way that I work with clay, kind of as like a spiritual practice, because as I was working on this piece, I realized that it was becoming this object that was really imbued with magical thinking for me. So I was kind of like, it felt like a container for my prayers at the time, about my experience with my mom and about her diagnosis. And so it made me realize that the way I was using clay made it feel as though I was creating these like talismans for myself, or these objects that just had this kind of like power to me. And so I started to wonder what would happen if I started to focus more on my own personal story or my own personal history in my pieces, rather than trying to generalize for anybody other than myself. And so I was still using some fracturing and truncation, and started to make these vanitas portraits of myself in spaces that I'd lived in over the years. So I started to mine through my old photographs of spaces that I'd been in, or places I'd lived, or scenes that held some kind of meaning for me, and started to piece them together into these portraits. And so vanitas is often attributed to a Dutch style of painting, where essentially it's like memento mori. So it's about the transience of life. So often in the Dutch paintings, it would be a scene with rotting fruit, with flies, or symbols of opulence and gold, or clocks, things that kind of show like the I don't know, the temporariness of things, of everyday life. And so creating these pieces really helped me think about the kind of like overarching trajectory that I had been on up till now, with having moved around a lot through the years. And it made me think about the concept of home and how that had started to feel pretty slippery to me. So after this series of vanitas portraits, I reached a breaking point using the two-dimensional format, and I started to think about branching into 3D installation. I started to work on a series of almost life-scale self-portraits. And my idea was that I wanted to go as far as I possibly could in like depicting myself using signifiers of my identity. And so I have a little bit of a tendency, especially at this time when I was just at the studio all the time, to dress a little bit like a cartoon character, like wearing repeated, the same thing often, or kind of this quintessential outfit. And so I started using this as kind of like a way to depict myself as a character or a uniform, kind of like the shell of the body instead of nudity. And what this helped me do is it helped me kind of think about the mythology of myself, and the way that my external self could align and also alienate my internal self. And a big part of starting this series, a big influence on it, was the movie The Holy Mountain, which is an art film. And this movie talks a lot about like spirituality and identity, and kind of the idea of like worldly things and ego. And so there's a scene in this that kind of sparked this body of work, where the characters in this movie are all the different planets. So each different planet has kind of a deity, and they're all sitting around this round table together, and they each have a copy, like a doppelganger sculpture of themselves. And there's a huge bonfire in the center of the table, and they all throw their sculpture of themselves into the fire, along with like all their money and like worldly possessions. And for me, that really just made me think about just the ego, or the external projection of ourselves, in a way that influenced this work. And this piece, called The Projectionist, is based on a self-portrait photograph that I took of myself in a small sunroom that I had in my apartment at the time. And I decided to recreate the space and all the objects in it to create this like simulacra of the objects. So the coffee cup and the plant and the bust are all recreations of things that would have originally been in this room. And what I was trying to do by recreating the objects was create this unstable boundary between what's real or not. And this is the photograph that piece is based on. And so I'm not an expert photographer by any means, but I do use photography and I'm influenced by photography a lot. So I take a lot of photos of my process and things that I find interesting in the world. And I also take photos of myself with my pieces now when I'm done making pieces. And photographers like Diane Arbus or Francesca Woodman, who there's a nod to in this photo, the book in the dresser actually says Francesca Woodman on it. They've really influenced the way that I depict the body and the way that I think about identity. And so this is an example of work by Francesca Woodman, who's the daughter of Betty Woodman, the famous ceramicist. And I'm really interested in the way that she depicts her like identity as kind of like fragile or like you're unable to pin it down. And she uses these beautiful like found object spaces that that just feel like really rundown suburban interiors. And so my work at the time started to approach the idea of the uncanny from a different angle than I'd previously been thinking about it. So the idea of the uncanny is often related to writing on the subject by Sigmund Freud. And the basic premise is that the word uncanny is translated from the German word unheimlich, which means unhomelike. And so there are two components to something being uncanny. One is that it's familiar to you, and the other is that it's unsettling and eerie. And so I was thinking about how the home and domestic space could also have to do with the uncanny and the way that you come across objects in space. And part of the power of the uncanny with figurative sculpture is that it's really hard to come across something that is shaped like a body and the size of a body and not imagine that there's a spirit inside of it. And so I started to think kind of about the spirit of objects in space or the spirit of an object that you carry with you. Like if you move a lot and there's something, it's not necessarily functional, but you bring it from place to place, and how those objects can, have to do with memory, or they can have to do with your childhood or things that are generational. And the way that I'm using the self-portrait figure in my work is as like a doppelganger or as a body double. And it's a way for me to process moments or memories that I find spiritually troubling. And in another way, it's almost like a performance because it allows me to like be seen in moments that usually would be hidden for the comfort of others. So my work in the past couple of years has been really deeply affected by my mom's passing in 2020. And for me, making this work has been a way for me to engage with my own grief and to explore and think about the ways that that it's transformed me as a person, the ways that it's broken down my identity, the way that you rebuild from losing somebody who's so central in your life. And the other powerful thing about making work about grief, although it is a little morose, is that I think that it also provides space for conversation with other people who are affected by grief, since it's something that's often pushed kind of underneath the surface of life. So making this work has allowed for like really reaffirming conversations with other people who are having similar experiences. And in 2021, I received my master's degree from IU, and I was offered a position as the Lorena Salter Fellow at Baltimore Clayworks, which I accepted. And in the year that I've been here, I've been thinking in the same vein about creating portraiture that that kind of deals with my own personal mythologies, my mythology of self, and the way that spirituality and like mysticism have had to do with kind of my search for meaning after this loss. And so, a goal that I have in my work, something I pursue in my work is to capture the spirit of life inside of objects, and also to work from an honest and a vulnerable place with sculpture, to use it as a tool to process my own reality and the unstable nature of reality. And I use making these installations as a form of autobiography and a way to process memories or my own personal rituals or changes in identity. And so recently, after making this body of work for the show that closed out my Lormina Salter Fellowship, I have been rethinking my studio practice, thinking about self-portraiture, thinking about how to depict similar themes, maybe departing away from using the reiteration of myself. And so this work was on view at the Clayworks Gallery from, I think, the end of June until mid-August of this past year. And I've just been in the mode in the studio where I'm just trying different things since then and figuring out where to go from here. So thank you for listening to me today. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Rebecca, for organizing this, and Baltimore Clayworks. Thank you.